Okay, we're in the book of Zechariah. If you want to go ahead and turn there, Zechariah, we're going to be looking at chapter 11. In chapter 10, it kind of fits in, of course, the flow. When we look at the flow of the way the chapters are going, a couple of the big messages. One, Zechariah is written around 540 BC. It's significant because it's about approximately 200 years before we see the Alexander the Great come on the scene. And in that conquest, then Alexander the Great's empire crumbles, divided up into four territories or major regions. And two of those most significant to us is a Seleucid, which is Syria, Iraq, kind of a part of Turkey. And they struggled back and forth between the Ptolemy region general. The generals was Ptolemy and Seleucid, and they inherited those, took those areas, and those developed into the major areas of influence throughout the pre-Christ arrival. The Ptolemy is where Cleopatra, she is actually a Ptolemaian. She's a descendant of Ptolemy, and she is going to be influential later on when Rome. So we're getting close to some really, I guess you call it recent history that's pretty dynamic in the influence of what's going to happen as well to set up the conditions for when the Messiah arrives. So about 540, as he's talking about this rebellion, and he's talking about this rebuilding and coming out of captivity from Babylon and getting the temple built, reestablish themselves as a new society, a new covenant with God. These visions that he gives in the first part are all encouragement. There's one that is talking about them kind of needing to straighten up, remind themselves where they came from. They ask him a religious question about should we maintain these fast days, and those fast days were to kind of reflect their humility towards why they were in captivity and their sinfulness. And in a way, it's kind of like, what were you really doing it for? You're doing it for yourself, God was response. And so basically, he then shows them that it's not about ritual, it's about the heart, and that he is going to take those fasting days and turn those into joyous days. But then as he switches in the book from basically chapter 10 on, we start to see more clear messaging. The messaging, though, is also very historic, and it's encrypted to a level that in some ways they weren't going to be able to understand it as they heard it. But as the historic events were occurring, most of the scribes and priests were seeing history unfolded and seeing Zechariah being fulfilled. Now, I talked about how that when you look at Zechariah, if you were to see the total number of verses of the book and the messianic scriptures, that there are more messianic scripture in the little book of Zechariah than any other Old Testament book. So there are scholars who look at this and go, there is so much, it's talking about this Messiah. So he brings a charge in chapter 10. He talked about this idea of this concept of their shepherds and how that their shepherds, he has a problem with the shepherd. And so in chapter 10, he talks about calling them back to seek the Lord, to repent, and then his anger towards those shepherds, and then a re-strengthening of Judah. Now, and we talk about when he talks about restoring Jacob and Judah together, Jacob was really in this context at this time a reflection of all those tribes that had disappeared in 722 to the Assyrians and were scattered apart. They never had a return. They never had where they were released and came back. Babylon came in, destroyed Assyria, and those tribes stayed scattered, as was prophesied. But there is this messaging of this idea where all of God's people, the covenant, Joseph's, those people of the tribes that were dispersed among all the nations, were going to end up being reunified. And how this amazing way that God took his judgment against the people of the northern tribes in their dispersion and punishment, planted them like little seeds all around. In all of those little places where he planted them, those Jewish families that stayed there remained faithful, established synagogues where they would come together and they would read the Torah and they would sit and pray to God. And then eventually they would start traveling back to the temple during the main feast days. And that was going to be the mechanism in which the gospel was going to travel. So that's another one that's just fascinating. That is talked about really in Zechariah. And so this gathering and redeeming of God's people as well, because to them, they've been redeemed out of captivity. So it's like, well, we're all here, we're all that's left. So there's that picture in 10 about gathering and redeeming the people back and bringing them in together. So this next picture in chapter 11, we're going to look at the outline real quick and we'll come back. Understand the way that the poetic style, as well as sometimes the way that the writers would do is they would play out a role in it, and the way they would use some things in which they would understand. And so what he talks about in the very first 3 verses is the idea of fallen trees, and he's going to describe it. And this is actually, again, remember last week we looked at how that the description and the judgments coming against the nations sequentially, geographically, if you looked and followed those cities as he was describing them, was describing the conquest of Alexander the Great. And that one of the concepts when he talks about the Greeks in this is that the Greeks meant nothing to the people of the modern world. The Greeks would be like saying, the Malaysians. Who are they? They're like, what? Okay, you said them, God mentioned them. So the Greeks were something that were a conglomerate at this time. They were a bunch of independent little city-states that were not united, and it wasn't going to happen until Alexander the Great's father, many years later from Macedonia, the northern part of Greece, is going to unite all of them together. And it's going to happen rapidly. They come on the scene. And then we'll see how it's his son who then comes forward. So there's a part of that, tying that with Isaiah, where Isaiah describes in one of his visions this ram that comes up out of nowhere from the east and rapidly comes through like this raging ram, and that was Alexander the Great. And then all of a sudden is described as, it's Daniel, that this ram is stopped, dies, and out of that, 4 little horns shoot up. Guess who those were? Those were the 4 generals. So these prophecies really do kind of support each other, especially when you consider that there's hundreds of years between when one prophet is writing over the other one, and the way that they are still supportive of each other. So he talks about the flock and the shepherds in verses 4 through 14. And this is where he is now going to move from the Greeks coming in, and he's already he talks about this rebellion that's going to come and how God's going to protect them in the Maccabean revolt. That Maccabean revolt is shown the way that through Zechariah is how that the Maccabean, the priest Maccabea, was going to rise up when King Antiochus Epiphanes was forcing the removal of all Judaism culture. And he was not allowing them to practice anything at all, in total rebellion against Mosaic law. And that to the point where, because of this, they come in and they try to make the priest offer a pig on the altar. And one key event, when he tries to do this, the priest, Maccabean, says, no, we're not going to do this. And one of the Hellenistic, remember what Hellenistic is, Greek-loving Jew who loved the culture of Greece, decides he's going to go and he'll do it. And when he steps forward, the priest Maccabea comes up and slaughters him, kills him and kills the soldiers that were trying to force this on them. And the Maccabean revolt commences, and it lasts about 8 years. During that period, what's fascinating is the fact that the leadership tries to get Rome, who's a little empire building, to come down and help them out and throw off the Antiochus group, the Seleucian Empire, and get them away. They're a little too busy, but it perked the ears of the Romans. The Romans are coming, but they weren't at that point. But this opened this door that we're going to see that's going to open up and remain all the way through well, centuries and go on. And so that's key because of what he has to say about these shepherds and the way they respond. Now, he's talking about these shepherds in the future. So we have a lot of historical things being revealed to them. And so he describes the shepherds and the flock and the leadership, and he will mention that. We'll talk about that. And then 15 and 17, he talks about this worthless shepherd. And it's kind of a reverse the way he's going to use this, but he's going to be looking at the Messiah and the relationship there that he has. And so let's go ahead and we look at the first 3 verses of Zechariah here. And he says, "Open your doors, O Lebanon, that the fire may devour your cedars. Wail, O cypress, for the cedar has fallen, for the gorgeous trees are ruined. Wail, oaks of Bashan, for the thick forests have failed. The sound of the wail of the shepherds, for their glory is ruined. The sound of the roar of lions, for the thicket of the Jordan is ruined." This is not only geographically significant because of the location being northern of Judah, and the way, again, this is another fall, an invasion depicting the Romans. Now, I've never been to Lebanon. It's hard for me to imagine, but Lebanon and this area region had massive wood. We know that King David, prior to his death, set up with the king of Lebanon in those regions to get trees and these massive, massive, beautiful cedars to be used for lumber for his son Solomon to build the temple. And it was a region, they have said that some of these trees were as big as the redwood trees that we imagine in California, well, in Northern California and Oregon, that these were massive, strong, and very invincible type of trees if you think about how strong these would be. He's describing, open the door, surrender. Open it up. He's kind of given this illusion of the strength and the beauty of these trees, but at the same time, how they're going to be destroyed. And so this northern region is going to be the avenue of attack, of conquest, whenever the Romans come in. Now, this, when I say that, is not the one when they initially occupy. I should clarify that because it makes it sound like this is the initial time. They actually came in and took over, and it was very peaceable. And it was taken over in a very much agreement. And this is a part of the problem. This is what he's describing is during the rebellion in 68 AD through about 71 AD that's going to occur. So now we're looking way into the future because of the rebellion, and we'll speak a little bit more of that. But he's describing this desolation of such beauty and splendor and strength of the north. And the avenue of attack, though, is what he's describing there as well. And so it's a terrible picture. And so he's saying to the shepherds, the leaders also, to wail because they're going to be, they have failed the flock. They're not going to be able to protect it at all. And the picture gets worse as he continues to go through here and describe this. And he talks about now 4 through 14, these verses are dealing with the shepherds and the flock. The flock being God's people, the shepherds being the leadership. And so that's what he's referring to here. Now, this is where we go from the symbolism and kind of poeticness of the trees and the strength and stuff to now he's going to describe Zechariah is now going to kind of play the role of a shepherd. And so this is what he says. Thus says the Lord my God, become shepherd of the flock doomed to slaughter. Those who buy them, slaughter them, and go unpunished. Those who sell them say, blessed be the Lord, I have become rich. And their own shepherds have no pity on them. For I will no longer have pity on the inhabitants of this land, declares the Lord. Behold, I will cause each of them to fall into the hand of his neighbor, and each into the hand of his king, and they shall crush the land, and I will deliver none of them from their hand. So he's talking about the conditions of the invasion that's going to lead up to this invasion and this punishment. And so he's telling them to become a shepherd to a flock that is going to be slaughtered. This is how sad, if you think about it, that your goal as a shepherd would be to protect the flock. Now, we know that, sheep eventually were prepared for the market and were slaughtered and prepared that way. But this is a flock that's purpose is to be slaughtered. They are conditioned and set versus a shepherd of a flock that has, they produce wool, they take care of them, they nurture them, but their purpose was not to be slaughtered. Now, our livestock, our cattle, well, that's what they are. Our, cowboys and ranches, their cows are set up, other than for some that are to breed more cows. That flock, in a sense, that's their purpose. Their purpose is to be bred, born, raised, fed, taken care of, and eventually the cows go to the slaughterhouse. That's not God's people. But this flock is. This flock has been prepared. And so he says, you're going to be the shepherd to them and to those who buy and slaughter and go unpunished. There's this corruption of this condition in which has been met that's going on, that he's going to sit and watch all this corruption go on. And the people, the leaders, are going to say, well, look at us. We're really prospering, when in a sense they've sold them out. Now, remember I mentioned earlier how the Romans got into the area and became basically dominating and ruling over them, was through an open door policy that the Jews had gone from. So they went from this group of people, the Maccabeans, who saw the Seleucids come in and take over and then rebel and say, no, we're going to stay true to God. We're going to keep this covenant, to all of a sudden, when the Romans start to come through, they just open their doors and they signed agreements with them. They compromise themselves. We see where the tetrarchs, or the governors that were set over them, they have no king anymore. They have governors. Herod, who was not a Jew, who the great Herod dynasty comes along, and they basically sell themselves to the Romans and set up this nation that is basically corrupt. And they are basically, and there's actually an estimate of over 100,000 Jews that during this whole 200-300 period that were sold to the Romans. The Romans took. And so there's this debased relationship that has evolved through the time that the Romans come in and start to rule over them. And it becomes a normal society of this illegal appropriations of the moral values that they start to allow, that they just learn to live with. They compromise everything. And this is what is the final status, really, when you see that Jesus comes. There's this relationship between the high priest and between Pontius Pilate, and how that they work together. We know that there was really two high priests during the time of Jesus, which there was not set up that way in the law. Romans couldn't deal with the high priest that the Jews were supposed to have according to Mosaic law. So what did they do? They picked one that they wanted. So Caiaphas and Ananias, at the time when Jesus comes, are considered high priests. But Caiaphas was not the one serving. It was Ananias who was the one that the Romans would deal with. You see how everything had just started to become so corrupt. And this relationship that had become so intertwined with the Judaism of that day was really a total abomination to God. They were no longer caring. And we know that the scribes and the Sadducees and Pharisees were also a part of this corruption and this hypocrisy of trying to project this righteousness when it wasn't righteousness. We see the way that they treated people. And so this is a description of this horrific situation that God is saying. And now this is the end of it. In other words, he is showing now where God is fed up with it, and it's going to come to a final judgment. And that's going to happen in 70 AD. And that they had gotten to that point where they had compromised. And some of the things that we see is this idea that, they actually had the audacity in John 19:15, when Jesus is before Pilate. What did he say? Whenever he says, is this not your king? Remember what they said? They cried out, away with him, crucify him. And Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, and they said, we have no king but Caesar. And this is really exactly the abomination that God is so appalled at, is the fact that here they are claiming that the Son of God, who is their legitimate king, is not their king. Their king is who? It's Caesar. And they were so afraid of this, and we read also in John 11:48, the conditions of their mindset about this relationship. They were so fearful. They said, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. That doesn't sound like the Maccabean revolt, does it? The opposite of what we saw in chapter 10, where they stood up and God protected them. And they were able to defeat the invading army. But now they're going to crawl in bed with the Romans and get to the point when the Messiah does come, they will completely reject him. And so he says, I became the shepherd of the flock, doomed to be slaughtered by the sheep traders. The traders being those that were really the false prophets, all those who were, false shepherds that were basically selling out the people to the Romans and allowing the Romans to dominate them. And I took two staffs, one named Favor and the other named Union, and I tended the sheep. So if we go to Psalms 23 and we look at the Psalm 23, we see that in that is the perfect shepherd, the one who is guiding the people, and he has two staffs. And one of those was a rod and a staff that he has, and they were used to take care of the sheep. So he's describing something, equipment that the sheep would be used to, the shepherd would have in order to take care of them. And so in a sense, here he is saying, I took two staffs. But he names one of them Favor and the other one Union. And this is going to be symbolic that he's going to use as he describes this. And one is grace, favor or grace. But this is also a shadow of showing how the Messiah comes, and that the Messiah himself will come with two staffs, one with grace and one with union, one to unite, one to bring grace and favor to the people. And he is going to minister. That's what the Messiah, Christ, was doing, was coming to bring grace of God and to bring uniting them together. All people, though, not just the Jews themselves. And so this is what Zechariah is saying that he, in a sense, has done with these two staffs. And he tended the sheep. In 1 month, I destroyed the 3 shepherds, but I became impatient with them, and they also detested me. So I said, I will not be your shepherd. What is to die, let it die. What is to be destroyed, let it be destroyed. And let those who are left devour the flesh of one another. One of the things is that the priest and the elders and the scribes were to be the mediators, the ones who were to be between them and God, and to help the sheep understand what they were doing and how they should be behaving and performing and living and such. And yet they were the very ones that had sold them out. There's over 40 different interpretations of who these 3 shepherds are. And nobody really can determine what they are. I think the best that I think is that we look at the priests, the elders, and the scribes. Those were the 3 groups that were the most influential, that would have been responsible in a sense of shepherding or guiding or leading the people at the day of when Jesus came. And they were the very ones. And so he basically says, I've lost my patience with them. And he reached a point where he says he destroyed them in 1 month. Now what does that mean when you say 1 month? Well, 1 month is shorter than a year. It's very quick. It's a very rapid time that he finally says, I have reached a point that I am now going to wipe them out. and I will let basically the Romans do what they want. You know, if you go back to all the other times, even with the Assyrians and the Babylonians, when God would allow these nations to come and to punish his people, there were boundaries. There were limits to where God restrained a level of destruction that he would allow to be inflicted on his people. God had a plan. Even the people of Ephraim, the northern tribes, even though they were removed off the land and the land was stripped barren, the people themselves were scattered and dispersed and taken care of. And even the ones when Babylon comes along, even though they burnt and razed down, God was still, even during the time when Nebuchadnezzar came and he captured them and he destroyed the temple and took them off, he spared a lot of the people until they provoked him even further. And then Nebuchadnezzar come in and he still destroyed. But there was a remnant. There was a remnant always God was taking care of, and he had a relationship where he would take care of them and guide them. And you'll remember the usage earlier in the chapter, in the book, where he describes how that Judah was the coal that he pulled from the fire, and he brings back, and he nourishes them, and they grow again. Well, when this picture here, what he's describing is hands off. No, not this time. This time, it is over. I am going to let them totally destroy you and wipe you out. Historically, in 68 AD, a rebellion breaks out in the Judean region. It's probably a little earlier, 67 or so, and there was a rebellion. And so they try to revolt. They try to have, I kind of laughingly call it Maccabean II. We're going to rise up like the Maccabeans, and we're going to fight these Romans. And you know what? God was done with them. That's the picture they didn't get. They rejected the Messiah. They crucified the Messiah. And God, in a month, if you think about it, there was a delay between 33 AD and 70 AD. You want to call that the month, where God finally said, I'm done. But they somehow think that they can rise up. And so they started a rebellion. At the time, Nero was the emperor at the initiation of this rebellion. He sends in Vespasian. And he goes in and he starts as a general, and he brings his son Titus, and they come in with 4 legions, and they start to destroy. And they start, guess from where? Lebanon. And they come in on a burn and destroy. And they start just going village by village by village south. And they start just killing and massacring because they're done. Nero's like, I'm done with these Jews. Just put them down. And so the Roman army comes in with 4 legions and starts this. Halfway through, Nero kills himself. And all of a sudden, there's this struggle in power for the emperorship, and it's called the Year of 4 Emperors. Vespasian is the commanding general, decides, let's put a pause on this. He pulls 2 legions and goes down to Alexandria. He leaves his son in camp with the other legions, and they pull back. And there's a reprieve. Well, the Jews in their arrogance think, look what we did. We got them to pause. Nah, it was just a moment. Because as soon as the dust settles, and the 3 emperors that are destroyed, guess who ends up on top? Vespasian. He goes and he takes over, gets into control, and he turns around and he looks at Titus and says, destroy him. Burn it to the ground. And Vespasian takes 2 more legions and he fires it up and he goes to war with no mercy. And I mean, he spared none of them. And he comes and surrounds Jerusalem and besieges it. And it was a vicious battle. Even from the Roman historical perspective, they will tell you that ranks up there among one of the toughest battles we ever had to fight. But when they finally enter in, and after this long besiegement, it got to the point where the people inside were so hungry that they had resorted to cannibalism. Let those who are left devour the flesh of one another. And this isn't the first time. There was other times historically. We know that the people were faced and they got to this level of barbarism. And so we see this here. And so this is where this idea that he becomes impatient with them. They detested God himself. And so God wipes them out. This isn't the end of it, because the Jews that were left on the land, even as desolate as it was, continued to be rebellious. And so it wasn't until 110, I think it was Emperor Trajan, who then finally says, I want everybody who is a Jew deported completely out of Palestine. Every Jew. And that's when they finally came in, and they, around 120, completely remove all the Jews out. They don't come back until 1946. They're gone. This is what he's talking about. This is what's amazing about this, is this idea. And so as he goes on, he says, I took that staff favor, grace, and I broke it, annulling the covenant. That's the covenant that he had going back to the days of Abraham. Now, what part of it, though, because there's a part that's already fulfilled, but there's a part of this that he's saying with the rest of the people, the rest of that flock of slaughter, it's gone. So the Jews that were left over that had not come over and accepted the new covenant are basically severed. They're no longer a part of this covenant. And that is significant to understand when you look at modern society or modern day relationship with what God has with what we would say are the Jews. Everybody says, well, they're still God's chosen. Well, who is Israel? That's always been my question, is that when we think about that, is who is Israel? And everybody that today, many people interpret it and they go, well, those people who are the genealogical descendants, well, who are they? I mean, if you really look at it, I mean, none of them even know what tribe they're from. If you were to go to Israel today, in other words, and say, well, what tribe are you from? Because that's their inheritance and everything was tied to their tribes. They can't. They can't tell, oh, well, I just know that I'm a descendant of Abraham, so I'm Semitic, I'm Hebrew. And so, but you see, this is the devastating blow that God gave that separated all of them away from that. Because remember, Ephraim, Israel, was also symbolic of union, of bringing the blessing that God had promised Abraham, of the blessing to all nations. But it gets blurred because everybody still wants to look at it literal and thinking that it's a very physical type of relationship that God was always going to protect and keep them as his chosen people. They are not his chosen people, the modern Jews today. They are not. I'm sorry. I know. I'm breaking... there's a lot of people out there, when they watch this, they're going to go, oh, Ron, you said that? Yeah, I said that because that's exactly what Zechariah is showing. He is showing this picture of this idea because of what they did when they rejected Christ and the way that they had treated the people, and they just threw off the covenant promises, that they reached a point where God said, no, I am breaking that, and now I have it, though. But Israel, Paul says, are those that have the faith of Abraham. Faith of Abraham. In Galatians 6:6, he talks about that, in referencing that Israel, in a shadow, is showing that it is now those that have the faith of Abraham, who believe in God, and that those are who? Those are Christians. So he never broke anything with Abraham initially. He still fulfilled it, but he showed how that there are those who believe that they still had this precious relationship. They always felt, and they threw out that trump card. Oh, yeah, but my grandfather is Abraham. Well, they reached a point where you refuse to accept it. And God still fulfilled it with all the tribes of all the nations. And he fulfilled it through who? Through Christ, through the one true shepherd that they actually had rejected and had crucified. And so now this is beautiful because it's Zechariah speaking in the sense of being the good shepherd, but he's also, in a sense, reflecting Jesus himself. And you'll recognize some of this. And then I said to them, if it seems good to you, give me my wages. If not, keep them. And they weighed out as my wages 30 pieces of silver. Then the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter. So the lordly price at which I was priced by them. So I took them 30 pieces of silver, and I threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. Boy, sound familiar? Sound very familiar, exactly what happened? It was Judas who betrayed the Lord, who by his betrayal was paid 30 pieces of silver. 30 pieces of silver was the price of a slave. It was a cheap price. 30 pieces of silver was also, according to the law, the price you had to pay if a slave was gored by a bull and injured was 30 pieces of silver. Potter was a position, somebody who served in the temple of like the janitor. You know, it's the lowest level. It's showing how devalued that the Messiah himself was treated. And so it's the Lord saying, if it seems good to you, pay me what I'm due. What was the Messiah worth to them? Everything. He was the most precious thing that God had ever given them. And he says, pay me my wages. What did Christ expect? What did he want? What did he deserve? He deserved glory. He deserved love. He deserved submission. He was giving them everything. And what did they give him? 30 pieces of silver. That's what they valued him. And so the Lord said, take that. Take that silver, that worthless wage that you devalued such a precious son of mine, and throw it to the potter. And this is exactly what Judas did. He came into the temple afterwards, and when he refused to take it, when it finally dawned on him the betrayal that he did, he gave it, and they said, we don't want that back. It's blood money. There was also, it was like Crime Stoppers money that you got as a reward, that if you would give information about a criminal or somebody, it was a bounty. And so that's a part of that price, and they set it, ironically, at 30 pieces of silver. So you see, this is Zechariah. This is 500 years before the Messiah was coming. And look at this immense, this beautiful picture, and see the Messiah standing, in a sense, before all of the people. Instead of them saying, he is our Lord, he is our God, what did they chant? Crucify him. He's not our king. We have no king except for Caesar. They basically sold him out for 30 pieces of silver. And they wondered why God lost patience with him, and in 30 days he destroys them completely. And he did not let the Romans, he did not hold them back from any type of horrific death and things that he put upon them. Then I broke the second staff, union. Remember, he came with the staff of grace, and he came with this staff of union to bind, to bring together between Judah and Israel. And this is amazing. Remember what I just said about how that he had broke that covenant with them, the Jews that basically rejected him, and by the time of the rebellion, those who were left over. You know, there's kind of a grace period between the time that Christ was crucified that the temple services kept going on. I mean, the Jews were traveling back for nearly 30 years and still offering sacrifices and going on. And there was this period where the gospel was being preached. The gospel was being preached. Jesus of Nazareth is the Son of God. And what did the people do? They tried to kill him. They tried to repress it. They did everything they could. They continued. And this is that time period where God said, I have finally lost patience with the scribes and the elders and the priests. My gospel is even echoing out. Even after you rejected him and sold him out for 30 pieces of silver, the message is still being proclaimed that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. On the day of Pentecost, I had my apostles stand up and preach that to you. And there were some who accepted it, but you still stubbornly, there were many who still stubbornly rebelled and fought against God and detested God. And God said, now I detest you. And after a certain period of time, then he said, that's it. And those 30 days, then the Romans come in and just burn and destroy. And God says, I'm done. I'm done with you. So now the grace is gone. Favor you rejected. Then he takes the union staff, where it was to come and to unite, to bring them all together. And he breaks it. In that destruction and that taking of the people, he breaks this union with them. And that, though, annihilating between Judah and Israel. And if you think about it literally, you're sitting there going, whoa, let's talk about that. Now, Judah was the only tribe left. Israel were the 10 northern tribes, and they were all dispersed, so they're already gone. I thought you had already broke this. And to me, this is fascinating because, I found very few people, but this is what I have come to as digging into this, is that Israel has always been the chosen people of God, regardless of race, color, or creed. It was about those who had the faith. Judah was the physical nation, the Jews that were left over, and Israel were those that God had chosen and that were still faithful to him, and that he had continued to try to have this union of bringing together Christianity and convert the rest of the hard-hearted Jews and bring them together and unite them. And it reached a point where God breaks the bond and says, that's it. My chosen people, Israel, will no longer have a part of you who have rejected and killed the Messiah. It's over. That's amazing. That is powerful. And now he says, then the Lord said to me, take once more the equipment of a foolish shepherd. Not sure exactly, but he's reflecting this. Take this, behold, I am raising up in the land a shepherd who does not care for those being destroyed or seeking young or heal the maimed or nourish the healthy, but devour the flesh of the fat ones, tearing off even their hooves. Woe to my worthless shepherds who deserts the flock. May the sword strike his arm and his right eye. Let his arm be wholly withered and his right eye be utterly blinded. This is once more a description of the shepherd who is foolish, who is taking and trying to implement what he has established as his own righteousness. The people that were guiding the people during this time of when Jesus came and then the final destruction, and showing how they don't care about the people. They've sold them out to the Romans. They've compromised everything. They don't care about those. And so woe to those worthless shepherds. You just abandoned them. And that was one thing that Jesus had always used a lot of in talking about who is the true shepherd. You notice that? Who is the true shepherd? They know my name. They know my voice. And when they hear my voice, what do? They follow. And so even though he was valued by most at 30 silver of gold, that there were those who were listening, who did come. But there were those as well, though, that were still being guided by these worthless shepherds who kept them on that path of destruction. And that's the end part of the way that he describes this final shepherd. And after about 110, and especially after 70 AD, never again have they ever offered any sacrifices or any ritualistic mosaic type of worship. And if you'll notice that even today physically, sitting on the place where the temple should be, what's sitting there? A mosque. And I'm going to, this may be a little politically insensitive, but if the Jews truly feel that they're the righteous of God, why don't they blow that mosque up and build the temple back to God? I'm not eliciting war, but I'm just saying they sure seem to be satisfied. And most people who go over there, they go, they're not any more religious than anybody in America. There's a reason the temple has not been rebuilt, because there's not that covenant any longer. It is with Israel. Judah, those who rejected and stayed back and were punished, have been separated. And it's a very hard message, but it's one that God is very clearly showing and depicting some very powerful, realistic historical events that did occur. Kind of a dark chapter. Next week, we'll pick up in chapter 12. If you got any questions or comments, disagreements, that's fine. I understand. You can put them in the comments on YouTube. So we always, as we conclude and wrap up stuff, we'd like to make sure that we offer an opportunity for people to be able to reflect their relationship with God. Because honestly, it's between you and God in your relationship. And so we need to make sure that we're always evaluating our spiritual condition. And if there's something that we can do to help you either establish that relationship with him the proper way, or if we need to help you pray and help you win your relationship with him, we hope that you'll think about these things and let us know while we stand and sing.